And now, for our speaker, Charlie Self is a UC Santa Cruz banana slug. And he earned a BA, MA, and PhD at that esteemed institution. And he tells me that he did not have the privilege to meet and discuss issues with UCSC professor and Black Panther member former Angela Davis, but was able to meet others of similar viewpoints. He is one busy guy. Many of you know him as Dr. History on KSFO's morning show with Brian Sussman. He also participates in debates with skeptics, interfaith forums, and other venues that help build understanding. He's an ordained minister with the Assemblies of God, and he's been credentialed since 1980. Charlie is presently the professor of church history at the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary in Springfield, Missouri, where he teaches courses in apologetics, church history, mission history, leadership development, and discipleship. And he's also a director of city development at that institution, as I recall. He's a senior advisor to the Acton Institute, which is a nonprofit research organization that's dedicated to the study of free market economics informed by religious faith and moral absolutes. What a concept, huh? In his spare time, he writes books, and 3 in fact. One is entitled The Divine Dance, another one is The Power of Faithful Focus, and his latest book, in collaboration with the Acton Institute, is called Flourishing Churches and Communities, a Pentecostal primer on faith, work, and economics for spirit-empowered discipleship. Oh yes, and he and his wife of 36 years maintain not one but 2 websites, drcharlieself.com and colorbrush.com. Tonight, Dr. Self will give his take on the most amazing election in modern times. I think we could agree on that. And his topic tonight is Back to the Future, the meaning and hope of the 2016 election. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Charlie Self.
Good evening. What a privilege to be with you. The last time I was with this wonderful forum, it was its first inaugural meeting. And there were about 70 or 80 of us hearty souls. And my speaker fee was a good dinner. So thank you. But can I just tell you, it's a real honor to be with you. And as I walked and met several of you, and I looked at the august speakers along these walls, can we just let the world know that conservatives are not boring, not uniform by any means. In fact, after tonight, I'm determined 5 conservatives, 6 different opinions. I also want to offer my special thanks to those of you in uniform who have served our country, and thank you. The politicians you served are imperfect, and some of the things you've had to carry out are difficult, but your courage is always appreciated. Let's give our military one more hand. My daughter, son-in-law, and his daughter were discussing the recent election in Texas. By the way, my daughter's recently become a Texian, and when they break away, she'll be the first empress of the new republic. But my daughter married a big Marine and has a wonderful 10-year-old stepdaughter, and he is the kindest, gentle giant you'd ever imagine, and was a fervent Trump supporter. Now, my daughter is a devout Christian, but struggled a bit with Donald Trump. No love for the Democratic Party platform. Our granddaughter listened to their marital debates. Mama, she calls my daughter Mama, why don't you like Donald Trump? Now, my daughter is newly married and decided that domestic tranquility mattered. She said, honey, some people disagree with some of his ideas and do not appreciate some of the ways he's treated people. She listened to her papa explain why he liked Donald Trump, and she said, I guess people need to do more research before they decide things. My daughter sent me a text and said, a good day for motherhood. What a moment we're in. By the way, my title was the same regardless of the election. Because what we believe in and stand for is bigger than any one election. Okay? Everybody relax. We're going to have fun tonight, I promise. In recent weeks, I've reacquainted myself with the writings of William Buckley, founder of the National Review, host of PBS Firing Line that I watched as a kid. Yes, I was one of those kids. My dad was a Long Island Democrat, a Harvard and MIT grad. My mom was the last Republican from Vermont. So at 5 years old, I could tell you the Goldwater-Johnson platforms. And when I was 9, I finished a 40-page report on Franklin Roosevelt. And I refused to talk to a girl in my class, not only because she had cooties, but because her parents voted for Wallace. While my friends in 8th grade were building papier-mâché teepees and maps, I was studying primary documents on the Cherokees being expelled from Georgia after the Supreme Court said they should stay. By the way, let's get Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. I'm all for a gun-toting Republican being on a $20 bill. Okay, come on, relax everybody, okay? Andrew Jackson's, an interesting fellow, another day's discussion. But I've been enjoying William Buckley's works because his erudition, civility, brilliance, and ability to debate with people who were on the opposite end of things is unprecedented and needs a successor. I've been enjoying the works of Arthur Brooks of the American Enterprise Institute. His wit, incisiveness, insight, winsomeness can help us chart a course ahead. Now, this election was really, really interesting. But the venomous rhetoric and reactions to the presidential candidates are not a new phenomenon in American history, or if you watch British Parliament on TV, they're not new today. Think about 1800 when Adams and Jefferson became mortal enemies, only later to reconcile. In 1824, Adams' son John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson did not trade niceties across the divide. It was Abraham Lincoln against the world in 1860. Grover Cleveland had to survive the fact that he had fathered a child out of wedlock as he was elected. Teddy Roosevelt divided the party, and the result was Woodrow Wilson in 1912. By the way, just to be really fair to history, in 1928 and 1960, it turned out the Vatican wasn't in charge of Catholic candidates. And by the way, most of their values we'd probably resonate with today. And in 1948, the Republican pollsters made the same mistakes most of them made on last week, November 8th. Same mistakes. They forgot that not every Democrat owned a telephone. And the polls were off and Harry Truman won. We could look at 1968, 1980, the year 2000 with the hanging Chad, and the year of self-congratulation in 2008. We've had a long history of interesting elections, haven't we? But in this address tonight, I want to tackle two topics with you: the future of American politics and a future for conservative thinking. Now, words change meaning with time. I hope most of you are aware that liberal used to mean free market person. It kind of got turned around. In fact, the American Revolution, by today's standard, was a conservative revolution, wanting to get rid of government control of the economy and government control of local governance. So we'd call that a conservative revolution, even though it was very liberal in its time. I would say this, that the term conservative needs to be recaptured again. We have lots of neologisms today, and lots of interesting words like alt-right and neocon. But I think it's time to recapture the word conservative. And true to our ethos, I want to explore history as we look at this election and we look at a future for American politics. I want to go back to the future with you tonight. And yes, those were very fun films. We used to make fun movies. So what happened last week? Did all the racists and xenophobes suddenly come out of their bunkers? No. Let me go on the record. Apart from a few fringe folks, That's not the reason for the current election. What happened? Was Secretary Clinton so flawed that Obama supporters defected? Yes, that's part of it. What actually happened? Beyond all the cliches, all the inaccurate predictions, the vapid generalizations, we have several endings and perhaps some beginnings. Centrist, moderate politics took a break in this election. It's been a long time since Newt Gingrich and President Clinton could horse trade and get 4 million people off of welfare. An even longer time since Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan had a cocktail together and managed to get some things done. Populism, of an order we've not seen for 100 years, was reborn in both parties, and there'll be much reflection as leaders consider the future. You see, what happened is that millions of people had felt alienated from both parties, and especially those in the conservative camp. This week, Thomas Sowell argued that both parties need deep examination, and that perhaps we should also send our prayers and thoughts toward President Trump, for we found in the last couple of weeks the adult candidate that turned the tide of an election, and hopefully that's going to win out over moments of petulant adolescent behavior. And you can smile and chuckle politely. Before we look back and ahead, can I just articulate again some of the principles that we hold dear? Here are some thoughts of what I think it means to be a conservative. And by the way, I'm in so many different circles, both in religious and business settings, that in some circles I'm this radical innovator, in other circles I'm this symbol of all that's wrong and won't change. So I feel pretty good tonight. First of all, as conservatives, we affirm the dignity, personhood, and integrity of every individual. We affirm that family, religious and civil institutions, and local governance have priority over larger agencies of the state or federal government. We affirm ethical free markets. Local and global access are critical for economic and social flourishing. Free markets have to include property rights, functional legal systems, a commitment to personal and social virtues. We affirm creativity and innovation toward human flourishing are welcome. We are conserving timeless principles. We're not afraid of change and innovation. We reject hedonistic libertarianism and depersonalizing communism. They are subversions of what it means to be human. In governance, conservatives believe that a true balance of powers is vital. Would you like to see legislators actually proposing legislation? An executive administrating? How about a judiciary that interprets in light of constitutional intent? This is what conservatives believe in. Go ahead. We conservatives affirm that ethnic identity is worthy of celebration, but not political and social balkanization. We affirm national identity with borders and languages and cultural celebrations is an important part of human freedom, but it's easily undermined by ethnocentrism, nativism, and other forms of totalitarianism. In economics, we believe in producing more than we consume, balancing private and public budgets. How many of you know we'd all go to jail if we balanced our personal budget the way the government balances theirs? All conservative principles require a commitment to transcendent moral values and a social ethic of the common good. So as conservatives, let's go back to the future. Election 2016 initially looks a lot like 1920. I know you all remember it well. A charismatic Republican was the nation's choice, repudiating the globalism of Woodrow Wilson. However, that's a little bit facile here because we've not yet seen a Trump administration, and I sure hope it doesn't go like the Harding administration. Harding led a scandal-ridden administration, and unfortunately, racism and xenophobia did emerge as fairly powerful forces. But underneath the transgressions, The voting populace was done with the condescending idealism of the man who promised to keep America out of war and ended up creating a global governance scheme the Congress and the people repudiated. There are some interesting parallels. I don't want to go back to the 1920s, but I sure want to learn from them. America said, we actually want people in office that remember where we live and who we are. So did 53% of Britain recently, when they said we'd like somebody locally to talk about energy use, not in Brussels. Election 2016 has some parallels to 1948, with smug Republicans presuming they could finally take back the White House after 16 years. Of course, they didn't consider in their polling was that a smaller percentage of Democrats had telephones. The predictions of a Dewey landslide ended the day after with humble pie for Hearst newspapers and people shaking their heads. How could this haberdasher win? How could this guy who'd never been elected win? By the way, the only pollster who was accurate last week asked a very interesting question. You remember it? How do you think your neighbor's going to vote? And all the people that didn't want to tell people who they were going to vote for said, I think my neighbor might vote for Trump. And by the way, I have deep divisions among all the circles I'm in, even within conservative circles over this election. How many of you know we got some work to do to bring folks together who even share our values? Election 2016 reminds me of 1976 and 1980. Now, you can't get two more different people than Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. And yet both were outsiders, each party placed in the office. Carter and Reagan were quite different, and the circumstances of their tenure were quite different. But they were both repudiations of the political correctness of the day. One more part of our survey of history as we try to think about how we're going to go forward. I hope you celebrate with me the passage of the civil rights and voting rights bills in the 1960s that brought millions of people the vote, access to education, housing, and job opportunities, healing the wounded conscience of a nation. It is only in my lifetime that millions of fellow Americans have had access to all of the prosperity we want for one another. Alas, this came at the expense of a more decentralized government, for it took federal power to break the systemic racism. But the radicalization of the Democratic Party after 1968 and the Southern strategy of the Republicans completely upended this narrative. Have you been frustrated with me in talking to people of all groups who forget who actually voted civil rights in? You're going, do you actually know what the voting was like before 1972? And people look at you with a dull expression and just say the Republicans are the oppressors and the Democrats are the liberators. Folks, first of all, it's not that simple. And there's many fine people of conscience in both parties. But the fact is the narrative's been completely upended. For those of you who share a religious tradition, who care about America's religious and particularly Christian history, some of the deep divisions in our society don't go back to the 60s or even the 1920s when we argued over evolution, or in the 60s when we argued over whether God was dead in the seminaries. By the way, those seminaries are mostly dead and the other ones are still alive. The roots of many of our present problems go back to the tragedy of the 1840s and 1850s, where every single religious body split over slavery. And only in my lifetime were those splits officially healed. You see, in the South, the personal morality was much more conservative. In the North, there were plenty of conservatives, but there was a more progressive mindset. Systemic racism evident in the South, below the surface in the North. But this dichotomy between personal and social brought a deep wound to our country, and we're starting to heal it. See, conservatives are challenged by these historical markers. On one hand, our proper focus on the subsidiary role of government, the fact that government should be after the individual, after the family, after the religious community, after the local civic community. And yet when there's systemic problems, the federal government from Eisenhower onward has had to sometimes step in. What can we learn from all of this as we try to forge a principled, flourishing future? By the way, you say, you're all very quiet right now. I promise you'll be laughing soon. But I want us to take a moment and reflect that the history of the United States is an incredible history of forward progress toward liberty and momentary setbacks as people wrestle with the worst part of their nature as well. You see, America is an ongoing experiment in virtue-based liberty, and progress has been halting, but it's been real. Don't you love those pictures of Ellis Island? Remember when we actually processed immigrants and welcomed a few million in? We love those pictures, except they're only one part of the picture. There's much more tragic pictures just a few miles north of here. Sometimes we've opened our doors and said, come one, come all, obviously, legally, justly. And other times we've slammed our doors shut. We've made progress, folks. The Irish we didn't want to receive in the 1840s, they own Boston. And the tragic, I have a little bit of that in me, and I used to have a red beard. It's sparkly, which is why I shaved it off. Many of the Asian communities we closed our doors to or tried to restrict in the 1890s and early 1900s, I think some of them have done pretty well. We've made some progress. We have miles to go. Americans in both parties in this election grew weary of the alienation, condescension, and being categorized as being part of some bloc. The women's vote. My sisters, aren't you tired of that? You're a human being with your own mind, and you are a wonderful woman, and you have your own mind, and you decide to vote for your values. There is no one women's vote. There are women who vote. The white working class, they voted for both parties. We have some work to do since they voted for both parties. The Latinos, excuse me, which nation, which business, which group? Are you talking El Salvadorian, Guatemalan, Honduran, Cuban, Chilean? By the way, down in Chile, unbelievable economic progress. Which part of Mexico are you speaking of? In other words, people aren't blocks. It's so interesting. I've walked into rooms and people have sized me up before I've said a word. Now, I know I'm terribly handsome and articulate, but they've sized me up before I've said a word. You're a white, middle-class, overeducated male, therefore you must be, fill in the blank. And then you start sharing what you really think about things. And I had this happen at San Francisco State University with Sussman as we were doing a wonderful debate and discussion on radical Islam. We had 32 professional protesters with their backs to me. And 30 of them turned around within 5 minutes as I just started talking history. And they said, "You're not terrible at all." I said, "You need to get out more." No. Folks, we have work to do, but the good news is people aren't mere blocks. There are trends, there are things we can talk about. People need to be respected for who they are. By the way, this group is evidence that we're not a block. We're a wonderful group of people wrestling with principles that we believe in and how to apply them to life. Americans were excited about hope and change and quite self-congratulatory in 2008, remember? I pledge. What are you pledging to? I don't know, I pledge. Even one of my socialist friends said that was the first Nobel Peace Prize for hope he ever saw. What did Obama do? He positioned himself as a center-left, fairly moderate, post-racial leader who would usher in peace and prosperity. And then the community organizer won the day most of the time. And we're filled today with the consequences of sincerely held but terribly misguided beliefs. The problem for conservatives is that our views are presented boorishly and shrilly too often. By the way, I'm on talk show with Brian. I love being with Sussman, and I want to thank you for listening. Keep listening. But Brian is one of the kindest. Yeah, go ahead and give him a cheer. He's worthy of cheer. Brian is one of the kindest, hard-working, most compassionate men you'll ever meet. If some of you remember, while he was with Channel 5 in news, more than 400 kids found adoptive homes. He and his wife themselves have adopted 3 boys. In businesses that they've had, they've employed the people that others wouldn't. Brian lives it out. Now, he's a character, and my job is to organize his thinking just a little sometimes. But Brian's the real deal. But I have to be honest with you. I love some of the ideas of some of the talk shows that follow him. But castigation, generalization, reaction, vilification, personal insults are not going to be the way forward. And I want to challenge us tonight as conservatives, not to be less passionate, not to be less firm in our beliefs, not to lack fire, but to direct it toward the ideas and actions that will transform lives and not direct it to personal insults to others. The other thing we need to do, go ahead, thank you. By the way, it's really hard when the other side is really stupid sometimes. It's really hard. 2 years ago, I made a decision for Facebook and for my website that I was not going to write what I felt when I first heard something. And my first reactions aren't even wrong. When there's injustice and foolishness, you react. But that's not going to win the day and change the world. By the way, there's another phenomenon we have to face. There's no longer a unifying consensus on moral, social, and spiritual values. Buckley and Reagan were raised in an America where divorce was frowned on and nobody debated the meaning of marriage. Politicians argued, my parents argued, but 85% of the principles were shared. Anybody remember a thing called Prop 8 in California? Well, I was targeted personally because I affirmed the global definition of marriage. I didn't pound my particular religious tradition. I didn't have to. 22 major civilizations and thousands of minor ones in the world have always elevated the one relationship that actually produces the next generation. But I also contended that sexual activists target educational institutions among young adults for their ideological and social recruitment. Never once did I ever argue against other ways of legally organizing adult relationships. Never once did I argue for deprivation of civil rights. I simply affirmed that you cannot legislate against laws of nature and the best way to welcome the next generation. Folks, our crisis today is a crisis of what it means to be human, what it means to be in a marriage, and what it means to build a free and virtuous society. So how do we begin to build for the future? Let me suggest to you that I want to talk about 2 areas as we finish this up and take questions and have a lively time together. For American politics in general, there's some insights I hope will be helpful. For Republicans, why did Trump win over Cruz, Santorum, Jindal, and other conservatives? It was more than persona or insults. What he tapped into were the disaffections and dreams of millions of people. Conservatives, we have to touch the heart, not just with the negative, but with the positive. The liberals and Democrats realize you can't forget the core of the country and condescend to those bitter clingers. The Republicans have to learn to touch the heart. The Democrats have to learn how to actually win back the heart. How do we build a new consensus? I want to suggest for us as conservatives, but as well as for the American political future, we've got to create a compelling vision of what it means to have a flourishing society. We need to have concrete policies rooted in real empirical data. We need to find out what our shared virtues are. How about a functional government in all 3 branches? But we also need to recognize the enormous forces arrayed against conservatism. And by the way, I'm always leery and nervous about words that end in ism. I don't want to be trapped. That's why I often say conservative values, because I want to keep my head about me to make sure that I'm not trapped by any person's system. But like every good conservative, trapped, as Luther said, by my own conscience as well as the Almighty. We have the dangers of fringe nativism and protectionism. We have the dangers of globalist fantasies. And by the way, you know what one of our great challenges will be? Should we actually have conservatives in office? Is how do you undo the Leviathan we've been building for 100 years, called the federal government? And when I say undo, I don't mean destroy, but to begin to streamline, make efficient, effective, and ethical. We have to get over historical misconceptions and futurist dystopias. What about the future of conservative thought in America? Well, first of all, we need to discover those deep well springs of dreams, desires, and unlike some well-known personalities, tap into those affections without the anger. We must avoid the patronizing intellectualism. And I'm an academic, and I'm saying we must avoid patronizing intellectualism. One day I was teaching a group of young couples in our church, and a couple came up to me, and my nickname was PC. Don't you like that, Pastor Charlie? No, I'm not politically correct, but I like the nickname. They said, PC, we really like you and we like being with these people, but we don't understand a word you're saying. Well, inside I'm sitting here going, I don't know how to make this simpler. You just need to kind of, get with it. But I kept listening and I discovered that, you know what? They were just as smart as I was. They had different smarts than I did. I grew up abstract. I thought I might even be an abstraction. I don't know. But I grew up an intellectual. And I travel in that circle naturally. And here was one guy. This guy was a great blue-collar worker, ran a couple of businesses, worked hard for his family. But because of dyslexia and bad education, he could barely read. His wife was the hardest working. I called her Madam Concrete because everything had to be practical. And they were raising their family beautifully, prospering, helping the church and society. And suddenly I heard this little voice saying, will you please listen to what they need? You know what they needed? They needed someone to understand where they were and connect where they were with where we all need to go. I changed how I taught. I didn't make things simpler or easier, but I began to adapt how I was teaching to be able to reach into their situation, and we quadrupled the size of the class because they went out and they were my evangelists. Folks, Republicans, conservatives, people who share our values have to discover where people really are and tap into their best dreams and desires. We have to learn from our best voices. Can I suggest that you reread some William Buckley? But can I suggest you read Arthur Brooks from the American Enterprise Institute? Arthur Brooks is one of the most brilliant freedom-loving thinkers on the planet today, and only he could put Charles Murray and the Dalai Lama in the same room. He believes in rigorous debate with civility. He believes in being a good neighbor to those who even want your demise. And then I would say for us as conservatives, did you hear this phrase in 1992? It's the economy. Conservative thinking at its best is nuanced. We need to acknowledge that we need public infrastructure, but folks, we need ethical private enterprise even more. The Acton Institute, where I have the honor of teaching and being engaged, has produced a new movie I want you to go get on Netflix or take a look at called Poverty, Inc. And it exposes the boondoggle of most foreign aid versus local enterprise. How many of you know it's a really good thing when somebody actually creates wealth on the ground and helps the neighborhood flourish? There were some Haitian men who had started a company to make solar panels so street lights could be lit. They were successful. They were lighting up the streets. Crime was going down. Enterprise was increasing. And then some Texas charity dumped solar panels on the country. And they went out of business. There are 1,000 nonprofits in Haiti, and they are no better off than they were before. Folks, Ethical enterprise that creates wealth, joined with public infrastructure, the rule of law and property rights, creates flourishing. Did you know in the last 40 years that the dollar a day poverty around the world has reduced by 80%? Why? 2 to 3 billion people getting out of poverty because of access to markets and trade. We conservatives want people to flourish. We want there to be fair global free trade, but we want people to flourish. We conservatives need to use careful critical thinking and empirical data to unmask the failures of statism and the importance of personal virtue, strong marriage, and work. Do you realize that when able-bodied people are merely receiving a check, that we are dehumanizing them? Now, I'm not a big fan of all the New Deal policies of the 1930s, nor am I a castigator of people at that time. Lots of well-meaning people. But I'll say one thing that's so important. At least they built a bridge or two. And folks, as we try to help those who need help, they can help themselves and us by participating in the greatest renewal of American infrastructure we've ever seen if we can get public and private together. We need to offer, as conservatives, a vision of being human that's compelling and culturally inclusive. Each person we meet is a unique creation deserving of our love and respect. We need to renew our commitment to local communities, local economies, local governance, exposing the overreach of some agencies, but also the intimidation of some business concerns. And we need to stand for ethical laws, property rights, and access to markets. Conservatives, there is an opportunity in this moment. What we have as a result of last week's election is a brief pause. Are you glad we have a brief pause? What an opportunity now. So let me do one more thing, being very practical. How do we actually get this out? Well, first of all, start telling stories of success through virtue. Start sharing visions and values without labels. Focus on empowerment. Engage in tangible service. One group, they were don't tell anybody, but I think this is on film, they were a Tea Party group. Shh, I actually spoke for one and my kids got worried for me. But I told them years ago, I said, you know what? And by the way, they had Republicans, Democrats, young, old, people from all over just trying to get some basic constitutional things reaffirmed. I said, your message will resonate if you actually do something for the community. And they went out and completely refurbished the senior center and made the whole area around it more beautiful. Their next meeting doubled in size. Are we making the world a better place as we work every day? Build consensus and make friends across the cultural chasms. Our neighbors are in a different universe than we are, and we are friends together. Are you making a friend? Refuse to lash out even when you're provoked. By the way, the more you show restraint and intelligence, the more unnerving you get to your opponent. It's so important for the principles we stand for. And by the way, can we keep a great sense of humor? I have to notice, and I want to be so careful, you notice how kind I have been to those who don't stand for what we stand for, and I will continue to be, but they just don't have the sense of humor that we do. I mean, it's just simply true. Folks, people are funny, and life is full of joy as well as struggle. Let's keep our sense of humor. You see, our vision of liberty will always face the danger of license or the leviathan of overreaching government. Our aspirations for integrity will always have to confront anarchy, and sometimes moral absolutes don't settle well with narcissists. But in all cases, we can forge a preferred future, one winsome and wise conversation at a time. Thank you so much. Now comes the fun part. Now comes the fun part. And people have written questions, so I'm supposed to look to my right, I think, that someone will come to the mic. And fantastic. Okay, well, it'll be a few seconds. That's okay. By the way, thank you for your attentiveness, for your engagement, for your patience with me. And I want to thank you for the amazing sacrificial work you do all week. Whether you're paid or unpaid, retired or active and working, at home or in an office, thank you for making the world a better place. As I was introduced, I work for a group called Made to Flourish, and we spend our time teaching pastors about what their congregants do all week. How many of you know our nonprofit leaders could use a little economic wisdom? And at the same time, you need to bring your deepest values to work. And so we're working to heal some of those divides, and we're seeing such great progress. So I get to travel the nation, encouraging high-capacity leaders to encourage us in our daily work. And I just have to thank you for the hard work that you do each day. So let's go ahead. We'll go to the mic here.
Let's start with a very easy one. Who did you vote for?
That remains personal. Everybody relax. Everybody relax. I did not vote for the loser. I had to tell people, by the way, that sometimes you may have to hold your nose occasionally, but folks, our local and state races really matter too. How many of you know California is still under the grip of a totalitarian regime? So we've got some work to do. So yes, I did vote on the right side. Go ahead.
NPR is the source of much information. What is your comment about NPR?
I would want to hear the person, the show. I want to assess specifically. In general, obviously, they are center-left, at least, if not left, most of the time. I will say this, when they broadcast global perspectives, it's worth listening to so we can understand how much work we have to do. The question comes up, should we keep funding such an ideologically oriented entity? And the answer is that I think we should call to account and ask them to present more perspectives than they do. I don't want to defund all public TV or radio because it does serve an important purpose. What I really want to do is infiltrate all of it with good, right-thinking people. And by the way, instead of just defunding and defaming, what do you say we get people voted in, get people appointed, and get people busy helping it be a better place? By the way, I just miss Mr. Rogers most of the days.
The next question is concerned with Mike Pence. Do you know much about Mike Pence? Do you think he'll help the Trump administration? Mike
Pence is a gift to the administration. Yeah, go ahead. Let's go ahead. It's all right. Cheer. Now, I'm being vulnerable here. That's why there's like 3 or 4 years between appearances, so you can get over me and then maybe forgive me. He would have been an outstanding presidential candidate, but he is an outstanding vice president, and I'm particularly heartened that he's being given a real role in the administration. He has both federal and state experience, legislative and executive experience, and underneath it all are core values that have not changed through those experiences. I've lived in D.C., and I watched a lot of people change. And to give Mike Pence real credit, he's kept his character.
Regarding the new president-elect, could you give us some of your thoughts or concerns about him?
Let me reiterate what I said in the speech, and I didn't mean it as a throwaway line. The last 2 to 3 weeks of the campaign, especially beginning with the Gettysburg Address going forward, and I don't want to defame the great Gettysburg Address, but his speech at Gettysburg, we saw an adult. And if that adult that we saw from Gettysburg forward listens to good advice, I have some hopefulness for progress. And by the way, I'm not trying to insult him. I believe his record of business accomplishment is real. I believe that he intends well. But it's been a very difficult primary and election season. So what I believe is this: if what we saw the last 3 weeks and what we see in some of the people around him goes forward, I'm really hopeful.
I have a question concerning the United Nations. Could you tell me some of your thoughts about the United Nations?
Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I wish it were located somewhere else. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I know that we need some place for these debates and for some of the services to take place. And on Sunday, I don't know how I pray about it. I think my deep disappointment is this, that in its inception, with the best well-meaning idealism of which my father's generation was a part, it's devolved so fast and so far. I don't want to simply get rid of it, but I certainly want to see us use all of our moral and economic influence to improve it. But I also think we need to avoid two extremes. One extreme is getting rid of that kind of forum altogether, which we need, but the other extreme is thinking that we need some kind of global governance. Folks, governance needs to be local, state, and national, not global. I'll say one more thing about the UN, and by the way, we can have wonderful debates on this. But there's only one place in all of the Middle East where an LGBTQ XYZ is safe, and that's Tel Aviv. And I think we need to stop the anti-Israel tidal wave. That doesn't mean we have to agree with every policy. It doesn't mean we can't forge peace. And I want to give several presidents and some leaders credit for briefly attempting this. But the UN really needs reform. Thank you. Go ahead.
This is concerned with labor unions. Is there a place for labor unions in this administration?
Yes, there's a place for labor unions vis-a-vis private business at all time. Historically, our labor unions had two origins. First of all, just the origins of awful working conditions and many, many religious and what we'd even call conservative groups behind them. They also had a lot of crypto-socialists and Marxists behind them. Okay? So our history is mixed. But when you consider the working conditions of the early 20th century, the rise of the labor unions is understandable. And by the way, I'm no fan of Henry Ford's morality or political opinions or many things. But he decided, you know, it might be smart to pay my workers well and not have to worry about unions. But to answer the question more profoundly, we do need labor unions, but we also need them to actually serve the workers they claim to serve and not merely serve the political ends. And we need vast and immediate reform of the contradiction of public employee unions. By the way, please thank every DMV worker. Can you imagine working there? Somebody walks up to you with a pile of paper and says, organize it. And your bosses have given you 3 minutes per person. Folks, we need civil servants. We need effective government workers. Please don't put them in a block either. Let's just make it better. But unionization of the public trust is a real contradiction.
What are your thoughts about Bannon from Breitbart News?
This morning I received 4 emails from conservatives calling him Saint Stephen, and I received 4 emails calling him something that I can't repeat in polite company. I'm not trying to take a pass here. I'm only going to say that I want to see what words and deeds flow from both his mouth and his hands and what influence he has before I pass a judgment, because I'm literally reading 2 different histories and accounts right now as I talk. I am always concerned when someone's castigated in such a way. So I'm gonna suspend on that and ask us to read more than one narrative before we come to a conclusion about anyone, but especially someone so close to the president.
Next, it's a question concerning the Electoral College. Are you concerned with it? Are you concerned about its future?
Every election, somebody says, get rid of it. You know, and this is, by the way, this is from I told you I knew Goldwater and Johnson, right? At age 5. At age 9, they were talking, get rid of it. Okay? So here's the thing. Our founders were brilliant. They knew that a pure democracy would devolve into urban centers and the rest of the country would be uncared for. They knew that 51% just by itself wasn't sufficient to represent the concerns of all Americans. So they created a marvelously complex system so that every state matters. You know what I'm glad about? I am so glad when someone says, you know, this race could come down to New Hampshire. This race could come down to Maine. Of course, isn't it funny to watch all these pundits kind of watch the whole tilt last week? You know. But folks, the Electoral College is brilliant. It's not a repudiation of representation, it enhances it. If I could turn the clock back in one department, I would have the state legislators appoint senators again. I would do that. If I could turn the clock forward, I would have term limits for elected federal officials as well. Thank you. Go ahead.
Next question. Would you have been concerned if Hillary had been elected?
Oh my, what a great question. You know, concerned is the polite word I use in discourse. At the very best, we would have had a continuation of the last 8 years. At the worst, not just by her hand, but by world events, it could have metastasized into much worse. By the way, when we like a candidate, we overlook a lot. And when we don't like a candidate, the smallest things become large. In the case of both candidates, we had some rather large things that we had to deal with. But I'll say this. I have never seen a public official with such a record of non-accomplishment that it just stunned me that people would, now with Donald Trump, he joins only 2 other presidential candidates with absolutely no political experience. And that's U.S. Grant and Dwight Eisenhower. By the way, they happen to be rather famous generals as well. One could argue that Trump's entrepreneurship and oversight of things, we'll wait and see. If he acts as an executive and lets the legislature legislate and we get a Supreme Court that actually adjudicates according to the Constitution, then I think we can be happy. But the reason I'm taking time to answer the question is, folks, we don't elect messiahs. Her election would not have been the apocalypse any more than his election is utopia, because the real issues remain on the ground, in the hearts of people, and that's where our persuasive work has to happen.
Next, and this is a strong one, have you found, or do you feel that we can establish any common ground with the Muslims in this country?
I can't establish common ground with this audience, but the answer is yes. But let me give you a couple things as a historian that people need to know. Number one, that the history of Western colonialism between 1870s and the 1940s is the backdrop for a lot of the reaction to the West. Of course, what's also ignored is the previous history of nothing but Islamic conquest. And in fact, it is the brave Polish cavalry in 1683 that kept the Muslim armies from encroaching further into Europe. So Islam in the next, and this is a prediction, not a prophecy, be very careful here, but I think it's a wise one. Islam itself is going to have a series of implosions. between different Sunni groups, between Sunni and Shia, between the variety of groups that rule the different states. There are several implosions coming. And one thing I have done, I have sat down with graduate students, business leaders, and others. I sat down at Apple Computer with Islamic leaders and asked this question: would you like to help me build a peaceful society where people could go back and forth between our communities without fear? Would you all agree that's a good thing? It's kind of called First Amendment, right? Well, I have found many well-educated, many who have appreciated what we would describe as the West or the developed world has to offer, who said a yes immediately. But I did find this disturbing. I asked an imam, don't you want that world? He said, I want that world, but I have to be careful what I say. What you have in Islam is a real challenge. There is no room in a religion for which submission is the primary value, not love, but submission. There's no room for a lot of creativity and innovation. That said, we have millions and millions of women and men who are cultural Muslims, not devout Muslims. And it's going to be those that I believe we can, number two things, be good neighbors with and challenge to stand up to all forms of intolerance and violence. I think it's a perfectly worthy thing for every person to say that every Muslim, Jew, Christian, atheist should stand against all forms of intolerance and violence in any form. Sir, I respect your deep passion, and I have hundreds of my colleagues and students evangelizing among Muslims. I understand it well. It's a system that is fundamentally flawed, but we have millions of our neighbors who don't practice it, or who practice it differently than its own documents tell you to practice it, and they need to be challenged to stand up to its intolerance. And the fact is, it's a complex thing. Well, I appreciate that, and you and I will debate personally, but sir, I really appreciate the fact that you have come out of that oppressive system. You're correct. I do not understand it the way you do. I won't pretend to, but I will say this. Living with deep differences is the brilliance of our First Amendment. Now, I'll say this. If people are unwilling to live in a pluralistic society with differences of conscience and religion, then they should not live in this free society and should find another location. So, I really understand. I have baptized scores of people getting free from that system. And I want millions more. I will be unashamed to say publicly, I want millions of more to get free from that system. Meanwhile, I have Persian, Arab, Indonesian neighbors who want a better life for their kids and who do not carry out all the rituals. So I am still compelled by my faith to be their neighbor. I'm not compelled to kick them out of the country until such a time as they prove unwilling to give me the same freedom I'm giving them. Please, next question.
We've had Brexit. Now we have Trump. Do you see this as a general conservative trend?
I would see it as a populist trend with conservative possibilities. Because honestly, I'm hoping our president-elect will actually implement conservative principles. And I'm hopeful, but I'm not decided yet. Brexit has elements of obviously elements of local and national concern behind it. I do think, yes, it is part of a trend. Here's my warning. Please encourage all trends that make more power into people, into local, into state, rather than federal governments or global governance. That's a good trend. But do not devolve into ethnocentrism, into racism, into the kinds of isms we've tried to get liberated from. And I don't see that yet. I see the Brexit as just being a popular movement, but it's got some real pregnant possibilities. And the original EC, European Community, and the EEC, the European Economic Community, started so well. Hey, let's not charge a tariff every time a truck goes over a border. How many of you know that's not a bad idea? It's the equivalent of Interstate Commerce Act. But it devolved into micromanagement of every part of people's lives, as opposed to a liberating economic system. So yeah, I'm very hopeful that we have a trend happening, but I'm also very nervous that the wrong kinds of folks will exploit it for the wrong reasons.
Next, and this is from an individual. It says, I'm very bothered by how crude and rude our society has become. Do you have any advice on how we can change this?
Yeah, we start tonight. Not being less passionate, and we'll have some passionate debate, and I'll learn from you, sir. So I want to thank you for expressing your opinion. And I'm sincere about that, and I want to welcome you to Liberty. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing your story. I don't want us to be less passionate. I don't want us to be less principled. I don't want us to compromise, but we can do it with civility, with patience, and without personal insult. And that's going to be the way. It starts tonight. It starts tonight. I actually called a couple of talk show hosts, folks you may not know, and I want to keep it private, but I called and I said, I want you to stay funny and passionate, and I want you to castigate every one of Secretary Clinton's policies. I just don't want you to call her names. Folks, you say, oh, come on now. No, it's a huge difference. It's a huge difference. Because when people are going to call us names and we refuse to call it back and in turn actually evaluate what's true and beautiful and working, we begin to turn the tide. This has happened throughout history. The tide turns when people refuse to lower themselves to the level of their opponents. And so, yes, the rudeness, the crudeness, the anger, the way we solve it is to go joyfully do our work really well and solve the problems and refuse to lower ourselves to that level. Yes, sir.
Why do so many people look to the government to solve moral and economic problems?
In the late 19th century, the Prime Minister of Holland was a man named Abraham Kuyper. He was a theologian, a Protestant minister. We'd call him an evangelical today in some ways. And he said, no one should die hungry, cold, and alone. Let's make sure that we do something to help people who've worked all their life. I think every one of us would say that, you know what, that's good compassion. And the modern welfare state was born not out of Marxism, but out of compassion. But the unintended consequences of structures that help metastasize or grow, become viral, and over time, to borrow Calvin and Hobbes, they transmogrify, don't they? And there's four things that have happened. Number one, we've lost the consensus of those transcendent values and a sense of personal responsibility. Those values have been lost in the collectivism that has crept its way in. Secondly, we've lost the positive influence of religious communities, even among people who aren't religious. The amazing thing is, when our founding fathers did their thing, there were a lower percentage of American colonists actually members of a church than they are now. And you had a far greater influence of those religious communities. Number three, it's a failure, frankly, of private institutions, family structures, and local government, because when it doesn't work nearby, you look to the distance for help. And if we're going to change the trajectory of the last 100 years, it's going to start with making things, and can I tell you, we really can, neighborhood by neighborhood, make a difference. I have watched neighborhoods and cities change. One neighborhood we worked on, getting education, government, business, religious communities at the same table with the media out of the room, by the way. We watched crime rate go down 90% in 2 years. We watched new businesses begin to flourish. My most enjoyable moment was when 40 Baptist women walked across the street and became reading tutors. They didn't have to preach. All they had to do was teach reading, and that school went from the bottom to the top. Folks, we can change things neighborhood by neighborhood. That's the only way we're going to reverse the trajectory. But I think we're in a really serious moment of 2 generations feeling entitled. Immigrants don't feel entitled. I'm talking about immigrants that are here for the right reasons. They don't feel entitled. They just want opportunity. They want a job. They want an opportunity for the next generation to do well. The permanent underclasses that only in my lifetime have begun to rise up, they want opportunity, and we need to open that opportunity. But it's the children of the prosperous that think that they deserve that prosperity that we have the most problem with. I always found it interesting with the Occupy Wall Street group that they were all walking around with their iPads. I just found that interesting. So what we have to do is, folks, we've got to reverse engineer this thing and begin to reclaim those values. Please, sir.
This is concerning the Trump election. Would you consider the Trump election being a positive result based on the work of the Tea Party?
Oh, great question. You know what? I'm going to give a I've not thought that before, so I don't want to overreach, but I think I'm going to give a qualified yes, and here's why. In fact, I'm just going to give it a yes. The Tea Party worked hard. Have you heard of these dates? In 2010, in 2012, in 2014, they worked hard and they got people elected, and nothing changed. And I think what happened is there was a galvanization of some of that intensity and energy saying, we're going to have to get the executive branch changed, that maybe that will encourage and put courage into the Congress to break that hold that the Beltway has. By the way, there is just a veil that goes over people's eyes when they get inside the Beltway. I don't know what it is. I'm saying this with a little bit of humor, but I watch really idealistic, hardworking people suddenly get all excited about, well, I went to a White House briefing today. Now, it was with the 3rd Undersecretary of the 4th Assistant, but it was a White House briefing. And suddenly getting invited to the right parties and the right seminars and the right places, and all of what they were going to change goes away. By the way, how many terms does it take to get a retirement out of Congress? By the way, it takes me longer than 2 years to get retirement, doesn't it? Folks, we need term limits, we need to privatize all public pensions, and we need to begin to restore the stewardship of the public trust. So what do I think of? Do I think the Tea Party was involved? Yes, I do. And remember, that Tea Party is a whole bunch of different folks. Public, private, rich, poor, of every ethnicity and culture, wanting to somehow have the American experiment continue. Please, sir.
I think we'll end it here.
Okay.
I want to thank you for your comments as a result, and thank you from the Conservative Forum.
Well, it's a real honor, and if I could just make a final statement before we clap for each other, because the applause deserves to be in this room. Folks, I want to thank you for not all agreeing with each other. I want to thank you for having civil and lively debate as you gather here, even for these meetings. I want to thank you for the variety of speakers, some of whom I would debate on some points, and hopefully they would see the light. I want to thank you for directly confronting things politely and firmly. But I want to thank you above all for what you're going to do tomorrow. Tomorrow you're going to go add to the beauty and wealth and value of our world. Thank you so much.